Hello guys, welcome to part number 3 of this whole James Monroe situation. So, James Monroe situation lesson we're digging in. So, you could call this a time period of strife, political strife, because we just went over the Missouri Compromise and how those sectional divisions is starting to consume America right now. But so we are going to talk about John Marshall. John Marshall today. He was our Chief Justice. So, despite the growing division over the issue of slavery in America, Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court worked to reinforce the feelings of nationalism that developed after the War of 1812. Marshall was a Revolutionary War survivor, and his experience led to strong feelings of natural loyalty. Although he had 6 colleagues on the Supreme Court, Marshall's position as Chief Justice, along with his personality, logic, and forcefulness, resulted in many rulings that reflected his personal view of the Constitution and his belief in a powerful central government. So let's jot this down. John Marshall reinforces nationalism. Nationalism. What else does John Marshall believe in? A strong central government. Which way is the arrow pointing? State or federal? What does he favor? Good. The federal government over the state government because he wants a strong national government. Because understanding these viewpoints lets you better understand the cases that we are about to dig into and how he ruled and his personal feelings towards each and every case that he worked on. So, during Marshall's 34 years on the bench, many important cases were considered by the court. Several of the most famous cases involved 3 major principles: contact rights protection, the supremacy of federal legislation over the laws of states, and regulation of interstate commerce. In 1810, the contract rights case of Fletcher versus Peck came before the Supreme Court. Members of the Georgia legislature were bribed in 1795 to sell 35 million acres in Mississippi for a small amount to private speculators. The following year, a new Georgia legislature rescinded the sale. The case was taken to the Supreme Court, and Marshall, speaking for the court, ruled that the original sale was a legal contract, regardless of whether or not it was fraudulent, and therefore protected by the Constitution. The ruling was historically significant because it protected property rights against popular pressures, and it also clearly asserted the Supreme Court's rights to invalidate state laws that conflicted with the Constitution. So, what was the main idea in Fletcher versus Peck? What was the outcome? So, the contract is a legal binding document. When we talk about contracts, we are talking about home ownership, car, business. Like if you're an employee, which most of you are, you signed a contract when you first started at your job. So it is a legal binding document that's protected by the Constitution, even if it's fraudulent, which happened in this case. In the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward, the state of New Hampshire tried to alter the college's charter, which had been granted in 1769 by King George III. A New Hampshire court ruled that Dartmouth was to change from a private to public institution. Dartmouth appealed the case to the Supreme Court, where Marshall ruled that the original charter must stand because it was a contract, legal binding document, and could not be altered or canceled without consent of both parties. So both parties had to agree for a change to take place. The Marshall Court ruled that the Constitution protected contracts against state encroachment. The significance of Marshall's ruling was far-reaching because it effectively safeguarded private corporations from domination by the state's governments. Unfortunately, the case set the precedent of giving corporations the ability to skirt governmental control. So it's a double-edged sword here between private and public. Only the states became aware of this dilemma. Once the states became aware of this dilemma, they generally wrote into charters the ability to make changes so that it was part of the contract. Slippery slope. That's my version of a slippery slope. Let's continue. A case in which the Marshall Court upheld the power of federal court over that of the states was the 1816 case of Martin versus Hunter Leslie. The state of Virginia confiscated land owned by a British loyalist named Denny Martin Fairfax. Virginia granted David Hunter 800 acres of the confiscated land, and Fairfax brought suit against Hunter for return of the land. The Treaty of Paris and the Jay's Treaty seem to make it clear that Fairfax was the rightful owner of the property, but the Virginia court upheld the grant to Hunter. The Supreme Court and Justice Marshall overruled the Virginia court, declaring that the land belonged to Fairfax and voided the grant to Hunter. The court's ruling rejected compact theory, the idea that the states were equally sovereign to the federal government. This ruling was significant because it enforced the rights of the Supreme Court, which held appellate jurisdiction over states' court. So this is the federal government over the state government. See, knowing the basics of what John Marshall believes in will dictate the outcomes of this case and our predictive nature. That's why I wrote. McClellan versus Maryland is often considered John Marshall's single most important interpretation of the Constitution because it dealt with the division of power between the federal government and the states. The state of Maryland, in order to protect its local banks, placed an annual tax on the Bank of the United States and other foreign banks. The Maryland branch of the Bank of the United States refused to pay, and Maryland brought suit against the chief bank employee called the head cashier, John W. McClellan. So, federal government over the state government. And he believes in strong central government, and he reinforces nationalism. Marshall upheld the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, using Hamilton's bank message of 1791 to support his position. He argued that the banks legally was implied in many of the powers specifically granted to Congress. Since the bank was legal, the Maryland tax was unconstitutional. For the power to tax involves the power to destroy, which was exactly what many states had in mind with respect to the bank. The Marshall courts ruling in favor of McClellan, used a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and with the ruling, strengthened federal power and implied powers of Congress. 2 years later, in the case of Cohen's versus Virginia, Marshall once again defended the power of the federal government. See a pattern here? The Cohen brothers were illegally selling lottery tickets in the state of Virginia, and the state authorities tried and convicted him. The brothers appealed to the Supreme Court, and Marshall upheld Virginia's right to forbid the sale of lottery tickets. The case reaffirmed the Supreme Court's right to review all state court judgments in cases involving the Constitution or powers of the federal government. In 1824, Marshall handed down his last great decision in Gibbons versus Ogden, the steamboat case, which involved the regulation of interstate commerce. In 1808, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston pioneered commercial use of the steamboat and held a monopoly of the steamboat navigation on the Hudson in New York. In 1815, Aaron Ogden purchased exclusive rights to operate a ferry between New York and New Jersey. When Thomas Gibbons, who held a federal trade license, set up a competing line, Ogden sued him. So they were fighting for the same waterway, essentially. The case was presented to the Supreme Court, where Marshall decided in favor of Gibbons, destroying Fulton's and Livingston's monopoly and reminding New York that Congress alone controlled interstate commerce. Marshall's decision once again checked the powers of the state and upheld the powers of the federal government. Many of Marshall's decisions while on the bench aided the economic development of the United States and created a nationality uniform environment for business. So unity. Marshall's landmark decisions also confirmed the Supreme Court's power on judicial review and firmly established the judiciary as the most powerful branch of the federal government. In a broader sense, his decisions acknowledged the idea of judicial limitations on the legislative powers and made the Supreme Court a vital part of America's system of government. With that being said, that's a wrap when it comes to John Marshall. See you guys in part 4 of this video, where we talk about the Monroe Doctrine, shifting from courts and civics to foreign policy.